Statistically, the person most likely to take your life is someone you know. But in a town where everyone knows everyone, that statistic becomes a nightmare. Welcome to Acme, Washington, a quiet, tight-knit logging community nestled in the shadows of the Cascade Mountains. In 1989, it was the kind of idyllic place where front doors were left unlocked and neighbors trusted each other implicitly. That peace shattered on the Friday after Thanksgiving. 18-year-old Mandy Stavik went for a routine afternoon jog with her German Shepherd, Kyra. Hours later, the dog returned home alone. 3 days later, Mandy's body was discovered in the freezing waters of the Nooksack River. Investigators found only one disturbing clue, a perfectly preserved biological sample that would sit silently in an evidence locker for 30 years. When the DNA of a ghost finally matches a familiar face, it forces a devastated community to ask a terrifying question. How do you live, work, and smile alongside a brutal killer for 3 decades, completely unaware of the monster hiding in plain sight? Statistically, the person most likely to take your life is someone you know. But in a town where everyone knows everyone, that statistic becomes a nightmare. Welcome to Acme, Washington, a quiet, tight-knit logging community nestled in the shadows of the Cascade Mountains. In 1989, it was the kind of idyllic place where front doors were left unlocked and neighbors trusted each other implicitly. In 1989, Acme, Washington was less of a town and more of an extended family living in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains. Nestled in the South Fork Valley of Whatcom County, its population hovered in the low hundreds. This was a community built on the back of the logging industry and agriculture. It was the kind of place where the roar of timber trucks was the local soundtrack, where people bought their groceries on credit at the single general store, and where locking your front door wasn't just unnecessary. It was considered an insult to your neighbors. The Pacific Northwest is known for its breathtaking, almost overwhelming natural beauty. Dense, towering evergreen forests stretch for miles, creating a landscape that is both majestic and profoundly isolating. In Acme, the wilderness was practically in everyone's backyard. It provided a sense of peace, a sanctuary from the noise of the outside world. But forests this dense can also hide things. They absorb sound. They swallow secrets. Mandy Stavik was a product of this environment, embodying the very best of it. 18 years old and glowing with the quiet confidence of youth, she was a freshman at Central Washington University, having recently graduated from Mount Baker High School. In a small town, a standout student is known by everyone, and Mandy was exactly that. She was an honors student, a cheerleader, a talented saxophone player, and a fiercely dedicated distance runner. Those who knew her described her as exceptionally bright, fiercely independent, and profoundly kind. She wasn't just a local girl. For many in Acme, she represented the town's future, a beacon of potential returning home for the Thanksgiving holiday. November 24th, 1989, was the Friday after Thanksgiving. The chaos of the holiday had passed, settling into a crisp, overcast autumn afternoon. The temperature was hovering in the mid-40s, typical for late November in the Pacific Northwest. Around 1:30 p.m., Mandy decided to do what she did almost every day, go for a run. She laced up her running shoes, put on a pair of light-colored sweatpants and a green jacket, and called for her running partner, her family's loyal German Shepherd, Kyra. Her route was familiar, practically carved into her muscle memory. She headed out from her home, jogging down Strand Road. It was a rural, winding stretch of pavement, flanked by dense woods on one side, and the cold, rushing waters of the Nooksack River on the other. Several neighbors saw her that afternoon. A local resident waved to her. A passing driver noticed the athletic young woman jogging steadily with her dog. It was a completely mundane, perfectly normal sight in Acme. Just a girl and her dog, disappearing around a bend in the road, swallowed briefly by the tree line. But the timeline of normalcy ended there. The first sign that the fabric of this quiet community had been torn didn't come with a scream or a siren or a frantic phone call. It came in complete silence. A few hours after Mandy left, the front door of the Stavik home was nudged open. Kyra, the German Shepherd, had returned. But she was alone. At first, Mandy's mother, Mary, wasn't consumed by panic. Rationalization is human nature. Perhaps Mandy had stopped at a friend's house. Perhaps she had twisted an ankle and the dog had simply run ahead. But as the afternoon wore on, that rationalization began to crack. Mandy was exceptionally responsible. She was fiercely protective of her dog. She would never have let Kyra wander back along a rural highway by herself. By 5 p.m., the sun began to dip behind the Cascades. In late November, dusk in the Pacific Northwest doesn't just fall. It descends like a heavy, cold blanket. The temperature plummeted. The shadows in the dense woods stretched and merged into total darkness. Mandy Stavik began calling friends and neighbors. "Have you seen Mandy? Did she stop by?" The answers were universally, chillingly negative. The last anyone had seen of her was miles down Strand Road, hours ago. The creeping dread turned into a community-wide mobilization. Neighbors grabbed flashlights and thick coats, climbing into pickup trucks to drive slowly down the winding rural roads. Beams of light swept across the dark, freezing waters of the Nooksack River and pierced the dense brush. They called her name into the biting wind, listening for a response that never came. By the time law enforcement was officially notified, the unspoken reality had already settled over the search parties. You could feel it in the dropping temperature. You could see it in the frantic sweeps of the flashlights. Mandy Stavik hadn't just gotten lost. The wilderness hadn't simply swallowed her. Something, or someone, had intercepted her on that lonely stretch of road. And whatever was waiting in the woods, the town of Acme was completely unprepared for what they were about to find. The agonizing uncertainty lasted exactly 3 days. On November 27th, a volunteer searcher navigating the brush along the Nooksack River made a devastating discovery. Mandy Stavik's body was found in the shallow, freezing water, roughly 3 miles from her home. The immediate hope of a safe return evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a homicide investigation. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office descended on the quiet town of Acme. Crime scene tape, a neon anomaly against the muted greens and browns of the Pacific Northwest, sectioned off the riverbank. The autopsy results were sobering. Mandy had not died from a gunshot or a knife wound. The official cause of death was drowning. She had been alive when she entered the river. But there was also evidence of a violent sexual assault. The investigators' mandate was clear. This was not a tragic accident, nor the work of a transient passing through. Given the isolation of Strand Road and the logistics of the crime, law enforcement quickly reached a chilling consensus. The killer was almost certainly local. He knew the roads, he knew the river, and he likely knew Mandy. In a town where doors were never locked, suddenly everyone was looking over their shoulder. And the police began the monumental task of interviewing a community where everyone was a neighbor, and now everyone was a potential suspect. Detectives cast a wide net, interrogating classmates, local loggers, and delivery drivers. Standard procedure dictated they look closest at those in her immediate circle. Her boyfriend, who lived out of town, was heavily scrutinized. So were several local men known to have expressed an interest in her. But one by one, alibis held up. Polygraphs, though imperfect, were passed. The immediate circle was cleared. This is where the investigation began to fracture. When physical evidence is scarce, detectives rely on eyewitness testimony. But memory under the stress of tragedy is a remarkably fragile thing. Witness statements began to flood the sheriff's office, but instead of painting a clear picture, they created a chaotic mosaic. One neighbor swore they saw Mandy jogging south at 2 p.m. Another was absolutely certain they saw her heading north at 2:30. Someone reported seeing a suspicious white van idling near the tree line. Another insisted it was a dark-colored pickup truck. The timeline of her final hour became a tangled web of contradictions. Detectives spent weeks chasing down phantom vehicles and verifying sightings that ultimately led nowhere. The sheer volume of tips, combined with small-town gossip, overwhelmed the rural sheriff's department. Rumors morphed into facts, and valuable resources were wasted investigating neighborhood feuds masquerading as tips. This was 1989. There were no cell phone towers to ping, no GPS data to pull, no ubiquitous security cameras to review. The most agonizing delay, however, wasn't caused by human error. It was caused by the limits of science. During the autopsy, the medical examiner had recovered a crucial piece of physical evidence, an intact biological sample left by the attacker. It was carefully cataloged, sealed, and placed into an evidence locker. But in 1989, DNA profiling was in its absolute infancy. It was a revolutionary concept, not yet the gold standard of forensic science. The police had a lock, but science had not yet forged the key. Months turned into years. The lead investigators retired, handing thick, dusty binders over to a new generation of detectives. The case went completely cold. But the evidence didn't degrade. It sat in a climate-controlled room, waiting. As the decades passed, DNA technology evolved at an exponential rate. By the late 2000s, scientists didn't just need a massive sample. They could build a full genetic profile from a microscopic trace. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office submitted the preserved sample to the state crime lab. The lab successfully extracted a perfect, pristine male DNA profile. They finally knew exactly who the killer was, on a molecular level. They ran it through SODS, the national database, holding their breath for a match that would blow the 30-year-old case wide open. The computer processed the sequence, and the result came back blank. The killer had never been arrested for a felony. He wasn't in the system. He was a ghost. But detectives knew he wasn't a phantom. He was a man made of flesh and blood, a man who still went to work, who still shopped at the local stores, and who had spent the last 30 years hiding in plain sight, waiting for a knock on the door that he believed would never come. When a DNA database returns a blank result, it doesn't just stall an investigation, it creates a vacuum. And in the absolute absence of scientific certainty, human nature rushes in to fill the void with theories. For years, law enforcement and the residents of Acme wrestled with two competing hypotheses. The first was the drifter theory. Interstate 5 wasn't far away, and logging routes crisscrossed the vast county. It was entirely possible that a transient predator had passed through the South Fork Valley, seized a horrific crime of opportunity, and vanished back into the anonymity of the American highway system. For the town, this was the preferred theory. It was a comforting lie. It meant the monster came from the outside, and the community itself was still pure. But the second theory, the one detectives quietly, grimly favored, was far more corrosive. The logistics of the crime pointed strictly inward. The killer knew the winding stretches of Strand Road. He knew the hidden access points to the Nooksack River. He knew how to navigate the dense, damp terrain without drawing attention to himself. Furthermore, there was the enduring mystery of Kyra, Mandy's German Shepherd. Decades later, this remains the most baffling aspect of the case, the piece of the puzzle that simply refuses to fit into any logical narrative. German Shepherds are inherently loyal and fiercely protective. If a stranger violently attacked her owner, the dog instinctively should have fought back. There should have been defensive wounds, canine DNA at the scene, or at the very least, a commotion loud enough to alert a nearby resident. Yet, Kyra returned home unharmed, untouched, and undisturbed. How did the attacker subdue a strong, athletic 18-year-old without triggering the dog's protective instincts? Did the attacker already know the dog? Was it someone Mandy recognized and trusted enough to stop and speak with, lowering her guard and the dog's, just long enough for the trap to spring? These unanswerable questions acted like a slow-acting poison on the town of Acme. The psychological impact was profound and permanent. The immediate aftermath saw hardware stores in neighboring towns sell out of deadbolts. Parents who once let their children roam the woods until dusk now kept them strictly within eyeshot. The unspoken rule of the open door was dead. But the deeper damage was invisible. How do you look at your neighbors when you know, statistically, one of them might be a murderer? The community began to scrutinize the mundane. A strange glance at the post office. A neighbor who washed his truck a little too thoroughly. A local man who suddenly moved away. Everything became grounds for suffocating suspicion. The town didn't physically break, but it fractured psychologically. Everyone retreated behind locked doors, carrying a shared, unspoken trauma. For nearly 3 decades, the ghost of Mandy Stavik dictated the emotional climate of Whatcom County. When the breakthrough finally arrived, it wasn't through a dramatic confession or a brilliant interrogation room maneuver. It was through the quiet, relentless advance of genealogical science. In 2017, an undercover operation involving a discarded soda can finally matched the DNA from 1989 to a man named Timothy Bass. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a boogeyman from the highway. He was a local bakery delivery driver. In 1989, he lived less than 2 miles from the Stavik home. He had watched the search helicopters circle overhead. He had driven the exact same roads. He had married, raised children, and lived a completely unremarkable life in the very community he had devastated. The arrest provided a name, and the subsequent trial provided a conviction. In the eyes of the law, the case is closed. But true crime rarely offers the neat, satisfying resolutions we crave in fiction. Justice in a courtroom does not answer the darkest questions of the human psyche. It doesn't explain the profound cognitive dissonance required to commit an act of unimaginable brutality on a Friday and return to work on a Monday as if absolutely nothing happened. It doesn't explain how a human being can compartmentalize absolute evil, hiding it seamlessly from a wife, from children, and from neighbors for almost 30 years. Today, Acme is still a quiet town, nestled in the shadow of the Cascades. The Nooksack River still rushes cold and deep through the valley. But the innocence of 1989 is a relic of the past. The Mandy Stavik case stands as a chilling monument to a terrifying reality. The most dangerous monsters do not lurk in the deep woods. They mow their lawns. They smile at the grocery store. And they wave at you from across the street.